Washington doesn't work. It hasn't worked in a long time. And that's been a gradual process, of course, that has now been put on steroids by the divisions of the Trump era and a president who sort of inflames them gleefully and willfully.
Have you noticed after news of trade wars, real wars, populism, climate change, a Mueller investigation, impeachment, and a fresh batch of U.S. presidential candidates, it all just starts to blend together? Well, if you're looking to make sense of 2019, this is your show. Actually, it's my show. Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today I'll examine this year's biggest global stories with a few very special guests.
In the world right now.
Then I'll sit down with acclaimed journalist Susan Glasser of The New Yorker to discuss the year ahead, particularly one of the world's biggest political stories, the impeachment of President Donald Trump. I've also got your puppet regime.
Hey, Crown Prince, are you gonna sing or what?
Well, maybe it's the eggnog talking, but I actually have a pretty good joke I could tell.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. What a year it's been. From protests in Hong Kong, Lebanon, and France, to the perils of climate change and cutting-edge technology that's reshaping the global economy, 2019 has been a banner year. Open your calendars and let's start from the beginning. January 23rd. Venezuela is in turmoil. The economy is in free fall, 1,000,000% inflation, and though President Nicolas Maduro controls much of the country, Washington has just recognized the opposition's leader as the country's interim president.
I'm a young man from Venezuela who wants to recover our democracy, our liberty, with all our people.
To the west is Colombia, where millions of Venezuelans are fleeing. I spoke with the president.
In the case of Venezuela, Maduro is sponsoring terrorists to plot against the Colombian people.
Against your government.
So that should be not only denounced, but it also gives a strong message that we all have to be united to condemn that regime.
Fast forward a month, February 27th, Hanoi, Vietnam. President Donald Trump is meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for a second time. It doesn't go very well, but the threat of escalation has been lowered. That's progress for the world. Not so much for those in the gulags or those just struggling to survive in North Korea, or even those who've escaped, those like Yeonmi Park.
Our existence is only for the party. It's not for ourselves or for anything else. We just live for the party.
Back in the United States, news is breaking, isn't it always? It's March 22nd, and Robert Mueller has finally delivered his long-awaited report to the Justice Department, ending a nearly 2-year investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The public will get the report a month later. It's dropping. It's dropping.
What's dropping?
The
balloons?
The balloons, the report. What do we think? What should we watch for?
We should read it.
Yes.
I think it's very important for people to read it and not just rely on immediate, out-of-the-box spin from the White House, from the president's allies, and even from the president's adversaries.
And across the pond, the Brits are confronting their own constitutional crisis. March 29th. This is the date that Brexit, or British exit, put them together, from the European Union was supposed to happen. But political disillusionment now hangs over the United Kingdom.
The truth about the Brexit referendum is that those who argued for Britain to leave the European Union articulated anger about the state of the country, but had no answers for the state of the country.
Further east, the United States is leveraging its trade power. April 18th, Washington announces new sanctions against Iran's Revolutionary Guard after unilaterally scrapping a nuclear deal that had been brokered by the Obama White House. Later, Iran shoots down a $130 million U.S. spy drone, nearly bringing America to war. Trump has a decision to make.
It's very clear that what he wants in Iran is some type of a summit where he can sit down with Iran's leadership, but he has no interest in conflict.
Keep heading east. May 23rd, the world's largest democracy has just handed Narendra Modi a landslide election win, making him one of the most powerful prime ministers in India's history. Modi's anti-Muslim policies, both at home and in the contested region of Kashmir, are bedfellows with a populist pro-growth approach aimed at tackling the country's most intractable problems.
Are you starting to see the average Indian look to China and say, you know what?
that system just feels a lot more effective.
I think a lot of Indians value democracy. So if it comes at the cost of sacrificing their democracy, my guess is many would think twice.
Back to the States. Miami, Florida has taken center stage. June 26th and 27th, the first U.S. Democratic presidential debates kick off in two groups because there are so many of them. The bid to replace Donald Trump formally begins.
As long as Donald Trump's in the White House, none of these things, these critical things, are going to get done.
In fact, his presidency is the most corrupt in modern history.
When people are stopping you on the street, what are they usually asking you about?
Most of the time I get something like, yang gang, or like, hey, support you. Someone called me the Asian Oprah.
As time wears on, the field narrows, and others jockeying for a chance to challenge the Donald fail to find their footing.
We do not have the means to pursue this campaign successfully.
My campaign for president simply does not have the financial resources to continue.
North of the border, another contest is underway. October 21, and Canadians are picking their own leader. Embattled Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is among the world's remaining globalist leaders, and though he edges out a win, Trudeau loses his majority in Parliament. The opposition supports, among other things, stricter limits on immigration.
My focus is not on what is popular or not. My focus is on how to make sure that Canada does well in the 21st century.
2 weeks later, November 4th, the Trump White House formally notifies the United Nations that America is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, despite widespread warnings of growing peril. And there is still no political consensus.
Half of all of the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels have come in the last 30 years. That's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established its IPCC. And that means that collectively we've done more damage to the climate knowingly than we ever managed in ignorance.
3 weeks later, President Trump makes a surprise trip to Afghanistan. It's Thanksgiving, and talks with the Taliban are going nowhere. America has been at war for nearly 2 decades, and the Washington Post will soon publish a confidential trove of government documents that suggests the war is unwinnable. You commanded our forces in Afghanistan. Yeah. Not easy service. What are we doing there?
Well, you have to go back to what did we think we were doing.
Finally, our calendar brings us to the end of the year, and coincidentally, one of the world's biggest stories.
Madam Speaker, the House of Representatives must now consider 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump.
A move of historic proportions, one that will reverberate across the coming U.S. election and set the tone for what promises to be a deeply contentious 2020. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and all the rest. Susan Glasser, New Yorker Magazine, letter from Trump's Washington. Everyone's reading it. Glad to be with you.
Lots of material, as they say.
As an insider in the Beltway, how is impeachment playing out behind the scenes?
Well, it's interesting. I do think it's a very different story in Washington than it is around the country. Understandably, the rest of the country, the rest of the world, it's not their job to take in every fact. I think there are probably low ratings for lots of previous Washington hearings, including this one.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't think that's any surprise, really. But I do think that it's coming at a time when the ability to create any kind of national consensus over the facts is so diminished. People just throw up their hands. I can't make hide nor hair of it. Even people on both sides, by the way. I think this is both Democrats and Republicans. Again, I'm talking outside the Beltway, or people whose job it is not to focus on it. Democrats may support impeaching and removing Trump because they loathe President Trump. Republicans may support him remaining in office. I think their views of impeachment tend to be highly colored by their pre-existing views of Trump himself at this point.
On both sides.
Yeah, I worry that neither side is really taking in the full impact of this story. The big takeaway that we tend to forget here in Washington is the rest of the country's deep, deep cynicism. They actually think that perhaps President Trump didn't do anything really wrong here because they think all politicians do this. It continues to be, for Beltway watchers, people who are watching in particular the ongoing owning of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill by Trump, it is kind of breathtaking to watch, even one by one, even people who were perceived to be moderate or who've been more critical of Trump in the past fall in line in supporting him, number one. Number two, to watch some of the arguments that Trump has insisted that his defenders used on his behalf.
The call was perfect.
It's breathtaking.
For example.
Not only that, but he actually has them arguing with a straight face. There was a 123-page pre-buttal report issued the other day by Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee. Their argument there is that Donald Trump is a noble corruption fighter in Ukraine. You know, this obviously does not really pass the smell test for anybody of any party.
Is your assumption that the Senate is now going to bring those sorts of arguments up, bring those sorts of witnesses up? In other words, do we expect a radically different process,
right.
topics in Senate?
Well, it's a good question. Up until now, the conventional view has been that we would see a somewhat more serious approach in the Senate, and that
because of Senate,
and that even Republicans who ultimately would fall in line and vote to acquit the president would probably express some concerns about his behavior, and would basically adopt the argument that while this behavior was problematic or concerning or troublesome or even perhaps worthy of censure, that it was not impeachable, which is very different than the defense advanced by the president himself and his allies in the House, who tended to be much more rabid. The key dynamic to remember is that, you know, Mitch McConnell, as the Senate Majority Leader, has long been sort of one of the underappreciated, probably most powerful person in Trump's Washington. He has been guided by one principle and one principle alone, really, over the last few years, which is the maintenance and preservation of his Republican majority in the Senate. He has Republican incumbents up for re-election in states that are very unfriendly to Trump, like Colorado, for example, or Susan Collins
in Maine. My understanding of the conventional wisdom, right until it's wrong, as you say, in Washington,
yes.
is that the likelihood of a Senate conviction is zero. Is that correct?
Maybe not zero, but certainly it's very, very low. You need 20 Senate Republicans to break ranks, given that, you know, even getting one has tended to be an uphill battle. You've seen this weird situation in recent years where there's the decline of institutional power in the American political parties. At the same time, this polarization means that people are more identifying as partisans than ever before. So you see the parties hanging in line more than ever before. I mean, you know, there were 31 House Democrats who voted at least to open the inquiry into the Clinton impeachment. Many of them didn't ultimately vote to impeach him. That kind of behavior was normal during the Reagan era. Now it's unthinkable. Washington doesn't work. It hasn't worked in a long time. And that's been a gradual process, of course, that is now been put on steroids by the divisions of the Trump era and a president who sort of inflames them gleefully and willfully.
Now, you've said that Trump reflects the greatest geopolitical threat in the world today. Now, you're someone who used to recognize very clearly that the Soviet Union was, right, the biggest geopolitical threat in the world. How do we go from an empire to a guy?
Well, that's part of it, right, is that I think the uniqueness of having an authoritarian-minded leader of the United States who has such an uncertain course, an ambivalent course toward the major remaining institutions of American leadership and alliances in the world at a time when there's no obvious thing to replace them except for sort of rising adversarial powers like Russia and China. I think the destabilization of the world's remaining democratic small d leader is an unbelievably consequential story.
So leaving impeachment aside, now we're looking ahead towards 2020. Your crystal ball, what do you think the biggest issues are going to be in the general election? Give me 2 or 3 of them.
Well, Trump would be issues 1 through 3, you know, at least for a pretty big chunk of the electorate. And, you know, you are already seeing that numbers off the charts. In some ways, actually, in both parties, by the way. You are seeing this motivation to vote, for example, is extraordinarily high, and I think is due to the polarizing personality and politics of this particular president. So, you know, most elections in which an incumbent is on the ballot do tend to be referenda on
that person.
those incumbents. Exactly. If it is a referendum on Trump, it's likely to be good for the Democrats next November. But, they're the Democrats, so, never underestimate their capacity to screw it up. The conventional wisdom right now is very much among, I would say, Democrats, Republicans, journalists, that Trump shouldn't win, but somehow will. And that he's winning. That is a feeling of discomfort with how the Democratic primaries played out so far. Perhaps it's a sense of unease with the nature of the Democratic field that has already brought in late entrants like Michael Bloomberg and Deval Patrick, neither of whom seem to be emerging, by the way, as any kind of savior of the Democrats. So I say that just as a sort of baseline setting. We can say that here in December of 2019, again, the Washington conventional wisdom is almost always wrong, so I'm fascinated to see what way it will turn out to be wrong. But right now, that's the view.
Now, if you have the ability to be reassured by something that matters, consequential, going into 2020, U.S. politics, it's what?
Look, I'm really looking to see what role, if any, the courts play and the Supreme Court plays on some of these core issues of executive power over the next few months. One aspect of the Trump era, which is not surprising if you look at Trump's history as a private businessman and his very litigious nature, but we're looking at a record number of really significant constitutional challenges that are making their way through our court system that delineate what kind of power and authority Donald Trump and future presidents as a result would have, everything from being required to turn over his tax returns to Congress, which is one of the cases making its way through, his ability to continue to make money from foreign officials and governments while in office, his ability to defy subpoenas of Congress for himself and his administration in the course of the impeachment proceedings. I think that we will really understand a lot more what kind of democracy we're left with when we see what, if anything, the Supreme Court, with its now 5-4 Republican majority, has to say about that. Chief Justice John Roberts takes great umbrage at the notion that there's such a thing as Republican justices and Democratic justices. And he will also be called upon to preside personally over this Senate impeachment trial. But will he really be able to command a majority to rein Trump in? Will there be any decision like the landmark Nixon versus United States decision that was, one of the culminating events of Watergate?
But you feel good about that?
Well, we'll see.
Well, that's what reassures you. So if you're being reassured by it.
I would be reassured.
Yes.
If both the Congress and the judiciary took steps, especially in this very difficult environment, to assert the prerogatives of a democracy that's of laws and not of men. I think that would be a pretty big deal.
Susan Glasser, wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
And now for Puppet Regime, where it's Christmas at the White House. And when these world leaders get together to share in holiday cheer, it's never a silent night.
4 fallen girls, 3 French friends, 2 murdered dogs, and a cartridge in a pear tree.
Bravo! The war on Christmas doesn't stand a chance against this guy. Hey, Crown Prince, are you gonna sing or what?
Well, maybe it's the eggnog talking, but I actually have a pretty good joke I could tell.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay, why could the first Christmas never have happened at the White House?
Because Stephen Miller would never let a baby from Palestine in here.
No, it's because you won't find 3 wise men and a virgin in this building.
He's funny, I like it. Kim, what have you got?
I have prepared a song for you. Silent night, silent night, silent...
There's more words too, right?
No. In North Korea, it is only silent and night.
Yeah!
Puppet Regime! That's our show this week. And if you like it, keep watching. Watch every week, because if you miss a week, I might know. Someone will tell me. It'll be upsetting. Also, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.